The first thing that went wrong was the elevator. The service lift in a private Manhattan building stopped between floors for exactly 17 seconds. Not long enough to panic. Long enough to be noticed by the kind of people who counted time as evidence. The soft hum of the motor died, and with it, the illusion that the night was running on schedule. A thin, unnecessary silence pressed into the metal box, as if the city itself had held its breath. Malin Ross stood still, shoulders squared, chin-level, hands relaxed at her sides. She did not look up at the ceiling. She did not reach for the emergency phone. She watched the reflection of the other woman in the brushed steel panel, watched the way her eyes flinched toward the corner camera, watched the way her mouth tried to keep smiling even with no one to perform for. Malin's face stayed composed, the kind of calm that was not natural but practiced. She had learned, a long time ago, that fear was a currency other people spent on her behalf. The elevator restarted with a smooth shudder, doors opening onto a corridor that smelled like expensive disinfectant and old money. The hallway lighting was warm and flattering, designed to make even the hardest faces look like they belonged. Plush carpet muted footsteps. Cameras were there, of course, but discreet, hidden in smoke detectors and decorative sconces. The place was built to observe without appearing to. At the end of the corridor, double doors guarded by men in tailored black stood like a border. Their earpieces were matte, their hands empty, their posture loud. Malin felt her pulse remain steady anyway. She had done this before in different cities, under different names. The geometry of power was always the same: controlled entrances, curated witnesses, and the unspoken understanding that everything inside was legal until someone decided otherwise. Her escort, Celeste Marrow, adjusted the cuff of her dress as though she were about to step into a gala rather than a private club that existed outside the city's honest maps. Celeste was the new patron of a foundation everyone liked to photograph: scholarships, hospital wings, community grants. A public woman. A beloved woman. A woman with a laugh that reached cameras more easily than it reached her eyes. Tonight she wore a gown the color of dark wine and diamonds that looked like frost. She also wore the false ease of someone who believed she could control the room. Malin walked half a pace behind her, listed on the invitation as an assistant. In practice, she was an object being delivered. The arrangement had been made weeks ago, tucked inside a chain of polite emails and donation pledges, disguised as logistics. An airline ticket, a hotel suite that belonged to someone else, a new phone issued with a number that was not hers. The kind of preparation that pretended to be hospitality. Inside the main room, the air changed. It carried the layered perfume of wealth and secrecy: oud, citrus, leather, the faint bite of champagne, the hotter undertone of bodies in close proximity. The ceiling was high enough to make people feel smaller. Dark walnut walls reflected light without giving anything back. A band played something slow, tasteful, and forgettable. There were photographers, but their lenses were narrow, aimed at the faces the room wanted remembered. Everyone else remained part of the furniture. The event was labeled a fundraiser. It looked like one from a distance: tables with silent auction items, glossy placards, a large display showing a rising total in clean, white numbers. But the real exchange moved under the music. Men spoke in short sentences with long meanings. Hands touched elbows, guided people into corners. Someone kept refilling glasses not to be generous, but to soften edges. Malin did not drift. She scanned. Cameras, 4 she could see. 2 she could feel by the way the room angled attention away from their corners. Exits, 1 main, 1 service, 1 stairwell likely locked from the inside. Security, private, not police, with the subtle arrogance of men who believed the law was a negotiable text. She caught the insignia stitched into a lapel on one guard, an abstract crown, no company name, an inside symbol, a family symbol. Celeste moved through greetings like a practiced politician. Smiles, cheek kisses, the careful warmth of someone collecting social proof. Malin followed, letting her gaze stay politely downcast when required, lifting it only when someone addressed her directly. She used her stillness as camouflage. People underestimated quiet women in expensive rooms. It made them careless. The first offer came quickly, hidden in a compliment. A man with silver hair and the kind of tan that required time, not sunshine, asked Celeste about the Foundation's new initiatives. His eyes slid to Malin as if evaluating a product without letting his face admit it. Malin noticed the signet ring on his finger, old gold, a black stone that absorbed light. She noticed the way he held his glass by the stem, precise, almost clinical. He had the hands of someone who rarely touched anything he did not own. Celeste laughed lightly. The man nodded, satisfied, and Malin understood with the cold clarity of a locked door clicking shut that her presence had already been announced. She was not a surprise. She was an item on the night's private list. The room's center was anchored by a low stage. Not dramatic, not vulgar, just a raised platform with a minimalist lectern and soft spotlights. It was placed so everyone could see it without feeling forced to watch. The kind of design that created consent through aesthetics. Above it, a chandelier hung like a frozen storm, catching light and breaking it into fragments. It made the air look sharper. When the host stepped up and began speaking about community and hope, people clapped with the same rhythm they used at funerals and mergers. Malin listened without listening, tracking movement. She watched the way certain men remained near the walls, how their eyes moved differently from the donors. She watched a woman in a pale suit slip a small envelope into a server's tray, then retrieve a different envelope as she passed. Paper moved like blood through capillaries. Malin felt a hand brush her elbow. It was gentle, almost accidental, the touch of a man passing behind her. But in that moment, she registered the contact as a signal, not intimacy. She glanced down and saw, between her fingers, a folded valet ticket she had not been holding a second earlier. She did not open it yet. She did not change expression. She kept breathing. She let the band's slow music cover the sudden density in her chest. A valet ticket meant a car. A car meant an exit plan, or a trap. In rooms like this, the difference was often a matter of minutes. Celeste leaned toward a cluster of board members and laughed again, bright and empty. Malin stepped half a foot back, pretending to give her space, and used the motion to tuck the ticket into her clutch. Her mind cataloged it and moved on, as if she were filing a blade under a sleeve. Then the room shifted. It was not obvious. No one gasped. No glass shattered. It was a change in temperature and attention, the way an audience quieted before a performer walked on stage. Heads turned a fraction. Conversations slowed. Even the servers adjusted their paths as if making room for something that did not require permission. At the far entrance, a man appeared. Jacob King did not enter like a celebrity. He entered like an inevitability. He was taller than most men in the room, but he carried his height with restraint. His suit was charcoal, perfectly cut, expensive without being loud. His hair was dark, touched with a controlled gray at the temples. His face had the clean, severe structure of someone who had learned to make stillness feel like a threat. His eyes were calm in the way deep water was calm. What drew attention, though, was the limp. He moved with a cane, the polished wood catching the chandelier's light. Each step looked measured, weight placed carefully, like a man who lived with pain and refused to advertise it. The cane was both support and symbol, a reminder of an incident the city's gossip columns had tried to romanticize years ago. A crash, a betrayal, a bullet no one officially confirmed. The story changed depending on who told it, but the outcome remained. Jacob King had stepped back from public life. Tonight he had returned. Malin watched him with the precise focus of someone identifying a storm by the pressure drop. She had never met him, but she recognized the architecture around him. Men who had been relaxed straightened. Women corrected their posture. A few people smiled too quickly. Others pretended not to notice him at all, which was its own kind of reverence. Jacob moved through the room, and people made space without being asked. He stopped near the stage, not on it, not claiming the center, but close enough to be seen. He did not shake hands like someone seeking approval. He acknowledged people with small nods, the kind of gestures that said he already knew what he needed to know. Celeste noticed him and brightened, as if this were the donation she had been waiting to display. She approached with a public smile and private hunger. Malin followed, because that was what she was for. The distance between Malin and Jacob narrowed to a few feet. He looked at her only once. It was brief, almost dismissive, and yet it landed with the weight of a fingerprint. His gaze moved over her face, her posture, the way her hands rested. It did not linger on her dress. It did not evaluate her like the other men had. It assessed her like an equation. Then it moved away. Malin felt something cold slide beneath her ribs. Not fear. Recognition, though she could not explain why. Celeste's voice rose with charm as she introduced herself again, as if Jacob might have forgotten her. People around them leaned in, pretending to talk while listening. The room had the subtle tension of a courtroom. Malin stayed still, the quiet satellite. Jacob's attention drifted beyond Celeste's face, past her jewelry, past the rehearsed warmth. He studied the room, its corners, its exits, the placement of security. He did it without moving his head much. His stillness made it harder to read him, and easier for him to read everyone else. A server offered him a drink. Jacob declined with a gesture so small it barely existed. Across the room, the auction display ticked upward. The numbers looked clean. The night looked charitable. Somewhere behind the stage, behind the wall of curated light, men were signing a different kind of agreement. It did not require ink. It required compliance. Malin felt, without seeing, that she was already part of it. The host raised his hands for attention and announced the highlight of the evening. A special contribution, a private donor's pledge to match funds. The crowd applauded. A few people laughed. The band softened. It was timed, polished, practiced. Jacob did not clap. His hands remained at his sides. His cane stood steady, planted like a stake. Malin's body responded before her mind did. A faint tightening in her shoulder blades, a shift in her breathing, the kind of anticipatory reaction that came from old conditioning. She scanned again, faster. A man near the bar adjusted his cuff and stepped closer to the stage. Another man moved toward the service corridor, as if to make sure it stayed clear. Security at the main doors subtly repositioned, closing a gap. Nothing dramatic, everything deliberate. Malin's clutch felt heavier with the valet ticket inside. The paper might have been an exit or a marker. She wondered, for an instant, who had put it in her hand. Then she saw the smallest thing, a reflection on a mirrored panel near the back wall, showing a sliver of the service corridor. A figure moved there, not dressed like staff, but wearing a staff badge. The badge sat wrong, angled too high. The person's shoulders were too tense for service work. Their hands were kept close to their body, as if holding something. Malin did not turn fully. She did not alert anyone. She watched the reflection and calculated. The corridor figure paused near a door that should have been for staff only. The door opened a fraction. A hand slipped through, passing something small and dark. The door shut. The room kept smiling. Jacob's expression did not change. He remained near the stage, outwardly passive. Yet Malin noticed his right hand, resting on his cane, tighten slightly. His knuckles shifted. His weight moved imperceptibly. A cold possibility formed in her mind. The host announced a toast. Glasses rose. Laughter swelled. The room's attention lifted toward the stage, upward, toward light and sound. It was the perfect moment to hide a violent act inside celebration. The attack came as emotion, not a spectacle. A man stepped from the side, close enough to Jacob to be mistaken for an assistant. His posture was smooth, practiced, his face unremarkable. He moved with purpose, not haste. In his hand was something thin and metallic, hidden by the angle of his body. Not a gun. Too loud, too chaotic. This was meant to be intimate and deniable. Malin saw the intention like she saw a camera lens. She felt the air change around it. Jacob's body responded with a precision that contradicted every rumor about his weakness. He pivoted, using the cane not as support but as a lever. His shoulder turned, redirecting the strike. The metal flashed. It connected, but not where it was meant to. A sharp, controlled impact, followed by the sound of a glass falling and breaking somewhere behind them, late, like an echo. For a half-second, the room did not understand. People laughed, still thinking it was part of the toast. Someone clapped. A woman's smile froze, then cracked. The attacker tried to recover, to turn the motion into something accidental. Jacob's hand snapped out, gripping the man's wrist with a force that looked calm and felt final. Security moved at last, too late to prevent the act, just in time to control the narrative. The attacker's eyes flicked toward the nearest exit. Malin saw something else. The attacker was not trying to kill Jacob. He was trying to be seen doing it. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the story to exist. Jacob released the wrist at the exact moment security closed in, letting them take the man as if it had always been their job. He stepped back, cane steady, and for the first time the room noticed what the strike had done. A dark bloom spread beneath his suit jacket near his ribs, slow as ink in water. Blood, but not the kind that poured. The kind that proved contact and danger while preserving survival. The room's noise changed shape. People whispered. Phones moved, fingers itching for footage. Donors became spectators. Spectators became liabilities. Celeste's face went pale in a way no makeup could hide. She reached for Jacob reflexively, then stopped herself, aware of cameras. Her charity smile collapsed into something human for one breath, then rebuilt itself. She began moving in circles, directing attention away, speaking without being heard. She was trying to regain control of a night that was built to remind her she never truly had it. Jacob stood still. He did not sway. He did not look at the blood. He looked at the room. His eyes traveled over faces like a spotlight that did not warm anything. He watched who looked away too quickly, who stared too long, who tried to leave, who pretended this was an unfortunate incident rather than a message. Malin remained where she was, heart steady, mind sharp. She could feel the valet ticket against her palm through the clutch. She could feel the invisible hand of the night tightening around her throat. Because in the instant after the strike, with security dragging the attacker toward the service corridor, Jacob's gaze landed on Malin again. This time it stayed a fraction longer. Not with interest, not with desire, with the cold attention of a man who recognized a piece on the board that had been placed without his consent. Malin did not flinch. She held his gaze with the same measured calm she had worn since the elevator stopped. In her eyes there was no pleading, no performance. Only the flat, dangerous intelligence of someone who understood that survival was never granted, only negotiated. Around them, the fundraiser tried to pretend nothing irreversible had happened. The host attempted to soothe, to laugh, to frame it as a misunderstanding. Security guided guests away from the stage, preserving the decorum the room needed like oxygen. Someone wiped a smear of blood from the polished floor with a napkin as if cleaning could erase intent. Outside, the city continued, indifferent. Sirens remained distant. Traffic flowed. The rain that had been threatening finally started, tapping against the high windows with a steady, patient rhythm. Inside, the night had revealed its true purpose. The charitable evening had been a cover for a redistribution of influence, and the first visible move had been made with steel, not checks. Jacob King had survived, which meant someone's plan had failed, or succeeded in a different way. Malin understood, with brutal clarity, that she had been brought here to be part of that plan. She was not a guest. She was not staff. She was not even leverage in the simple sense. She was a contract walking in a dress. And the room was already deciding who would sign for her next. The room where Malin Ross was taken did not exist on any official map. It sat beneath a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, close enough to the river for the air to carry a permanent dampness, far enough from residential blocks that no one cared about the trucks arriving at odd hours. The building above housed a logistics firm with a forgettable name and a clean website. The basement belonged to someone else entirely. Malin felt the transition before she saw it. The ride from Manhattan had been smooth, windows tinted, engine quiet. No sirens, no police radio chatter, just men who did not speak and did not need to. When the vehicle descended the ramp behind the warehouse, the city's noise dulled, replaced by the echo of concrete and the distant churn of industrial fans. The doors opened into a space that smelled of metal, antiseptic, and something faintly organic, like old water trapped in pipes. They moved her quickly, efficiently. No rough handling, no unnecessary violence. That would have been theatrical, and this place had no interest in theater. Her phone was gone. Her clutch was taken. The valet ticket disappeared with it, filed away by hands that understood its possible meanings better than she did. Her dress was noted, catalogued, then replaced with neutral clothing that belonged to no one. Gray fabric, soft enough to move in, disposable. The room itself was small, square, and deliberately boring. Smooth concrete walls, a drain in the floor, a table bolted down at one end, a single chair at the other. The light overhead was white and unforgiving, bright without warmth. There were no shadows to hide in. The ventilation system hummed steadily, loud enough to fill silence without masking screams. Not that screams were expected. This was a place for controlled outcomes. Cameras watched from the corners, their lenses dark and unblinking. Malin noted their positions without lifting her head too much. Too visible. One concealed behind the smoke detector. One she could feel rather than see, embedded in the ceiling panel above the door. This room recorded everything, not for justice, for leverage. She sat when told. She placed her hands on her thighs. Her breathing remained even. The men who brought her in stepped back, becoming part of the walls. Their faces were unremarkable, designed that way. No badges, no names, the kind of people who vanished from memory the moment they left a room. The first questions were soft. They circled around her identity, her presence at the fundraiser, her connection to Celeste Marrow. The questions were not meant to be answered truthfully. They were meant to establish a rhythm, a baseline. Malin listened. She responded with the bare minimum required to keep the process moving. Her voice stayed level. Her eyes stayed focused on the table's edge, where a thin crack ran through the metal surface like a fault line. She knew better than to volunteer information. She knew better than to lie elaborately. Lies created inconsistencies. Silence created space. The men adjusted their approach. They did not threaten her. They did not raise their voices. One of them placed a small tray on the table and slid it forward. On it lay a set of instruments arranged with clinical care. Syringes, vials, thin metal probes sealed in sterile packaging. Not medieval, not brutal, precise. They rolled up her sleeve. Malin did not resist. Resistance would have changed the room's temperature. Instead, she watched as the fabric moved, exposing skin that had once been smooth and now bore a thin, pale line near the inside of her upper arm. An old medical scar. Neat. Intentional. The kind left by a procedure, not an accident. The men noticed immediately. They exchanged glances that lasted half a second too long. One of them adjusted his glasses. Another leaned closer, examining the scar with professional interest. This was not something meant for her file. This was something that complicated it. Blood was drawn. The needle entered cleanly, expertly. Malin felt the familiar pinch, followed by the slow pull. She had been tested before, many times. Her body had learned to accept intrusion as routine. The sample disappeared through a slot in the wall. Somewhere nearby, machines hummed louder for a moment. Analysis began. While they waited, they changed tactics again. They left her alone. The door closed softly. The lock engaged with a dull click that sounded final without being dramatic. The cameras remained. The light stayed on. Time stretched. Malin used the silence the way she used air. She slowed her breathing further, controlling her pulse. She focused on small details to stay present. The vibration of the ventilation through the chair's metal legs, the faint smell of cleaning solution, the way the light flickered almost imperceptibly every few minutes. This was not her first holding room. It was simply better funded than most. She thought about the toxin. She could feel it if she paid attention. A subtle pressure behind her eyes, a dryness at the back of her throat, nothing acute, nothing dramatic. The compound had been designed that way. It did not incapacitate immediately. It punished disobedience over time, a leash disguised as chemistry. When the men returned, they carried confirmation. The test results were not spoken aloud, but Malin read them in the shift of their posture. The controlled interest sharpened. The casual questions stopped. The room recalibrated. One of them held up a tablet, turning it slightly so she could see the screen without being able to read details. Charts, chemical markers, a name that meant nothing to anyone outside a very narrow circle. A rare toxin, expensive to produce, difficult to trace. The kind used by organizations that did not exist on paper. This changed her status. She was no longer just a convenient suspect. She was evidence. The men asked different questions now, not about the fundraiser, about who had access to her bloodstream, about how long she had been exposed, about who controlled the supply. Malin did not answer. Her silence was not defiance. It was calibration. She knew the limits of the toxin. She knew how long she could hold without intervention. She also knew that speaking prematurely would not save her. It would only narrow her options. The men tried pressure without force. They spoke about outcomes, about cooperation, about how easily narratives could be shaped. They described futures in vague terms, letting implication do the work. Malin listened with the same stillness she had worn all night. Her face did not change. Her body did not react. She was not being brave. She was being efficient. Eventually, they stopped asking questions altogether. They left again, this time longer. Elsewhere, above ground and across the river, another process unfolded. Jacob King had not gone to a hospital. The wound at his side had been treated in a private room with a doctor whose credentials were impeccable and whose discretion was absolute. The blade had not gone deep enough to be fatal. It had been meant to mark, not kill. Jacob understood this as clearly as he understood the feel of the bandage beneath his jacket. He sat alone afterward, the room dim, the city's lights smeared across the window like distant fires. His cane rested within reach, but he did not lean on it. His posture was relaxed, deceptively so. Around him, his people worked. They did not rush. Rushing led to mistakes. Instead, they collected fragments. Security footage from the club was pulled, not the official feed shown to donors, but the raw angles archived before editing. They examined the 40-second gap when one camera went dark. They traced the override back to a terminal that should not have been accessible. They identified the guard who had stepped out of position at the wrong moment, then traced who had assigned him to that post. They pulled guest lists and compared them against known associates. They noted who had left early, who had lingered too long, who had not reacted the way fear demanded. The attacker's background was unremarkable by design. A man with a patchwork employment history, no strong affiliations, no obvious handler. He had been chosen because he would not be missed. But Jacob's people knew better than to stop at surface readings. They dug into the funding streams that had kept him solvent despite his lack of stable work. They followed the money sideways, through shell accounts and temporary companies, until it began to resemble an old pattern. Jacob listened as reports came in, one by one. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He absorbed. When Malin Ross's name surfaced again, this time in connection with the toxin, his attention sharpened. He had seen her scar. He had seen the way she held herself in the room, the way her gaze moved. He had recognized the discipline there, not military, not law enforcement, something colder, something learned in environments where survival was conditional. He requested her file. What he received was thin. Too thin. Her documented history began 5 years ago with a name change processed through legal channels. Before that, there were gaps. Entire years missing. No school records that matched. No medical history beyond what could be fabricated. Someone had cleaned her past with care, leaving behind only what was necessary to make her movable. Jacob leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. The attack at the fundraiser had not been personal. It had been a probe. Someone had tested his defenses, not to remove him, but to see what would surface when pressure was applied. The presence of Malin Ross, chemically bound to a handler, indicated something older had been disturbed. An old map. 10 years ago, a city had burned quietly. Not in headlines, not with memorials. A controlled fire explained away as industrial negligence. The kind of incident that created paperwork instead of outrage. Jacob had been there then. He had seen the aftermath before it had been packaged into reports. He had also learned, that night, the cost of speaking too early. Now, someone was checking whether the witnesses were truly gone. Back in the basement room, Malin's isolation ended. 2 new figures entered, their demeanor different from the earlier men. Less procedural, more curious. They did not bring instruments. They brought a chair, which they placed opposite her. One of them sat. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask questions. He simply watched her, studying her reactions to being observed without immediate threat. This was not interrogation. This was assessment. Malin met his gaze for the first time since her arrival. Her eyes were dark, steady, unblinking. They held no plea, no challenge, only awareness. The man noted the absence of micro-expressions, the controlled breathing, the way her muscles remained engaged even at rest. He recognized training, though he could not yet name its source. After a long moment, he stood and left without a word. The door closed again. The cameras kept recording. Malin allowed herself one slow exhale. She understood now that she had crossed into a narrower corridor. She was no longer being questioned to establish guilt. She was being evaluated to determine utility. Somewhere above her, men were deciding whether she would be buried with the past or used to unearth it. She also understood something else, with a clarity that settled into her bones. The quiet camera was not just watching her. It was waiting. Waiting to see if she would break, or if she would remain intact long enough to become dangerous. And in the stillness of the room, with the toxin counting down in her blood and the city moving on without her, Malin Ross did exactly what she had been conditioned to do. She survived in silence. The archive did not smell like paper. It smelled like dust trapped in climate control, like plastic sleeves warmed by fluorescent light, like time flattened into compliance. Erin Doyle noticed this immediately when she passed through the security checkpoint and stepped into the records wing of the state facility. The building had once been a courthouse, then a municipal storage site, then something renamed to sound modern and harmless. Its windows were narrow and high, admitting light without offering a view. The kind of place designed to remember without understanding. Erin signed in under her clearance, badge catching the light as it swung against her jacket. She did not rush. Rushing attracted attention, and attention distorted patterns. She had learned that early, long before she learned how to read between lines of redacted text. Her interest in the case was not official. On paper, the attempted attack at the Manhattan fundraiser fell under private security and local jurisdiction. It involved donors, foundations, and people who preferred their problems solved quietly. The state's internal security division had no reason to care. Unofficially, Erin cared deeply. She had spent years tracking the soft perimeter where corporate interests blurred into enforcement, where private guards carried more authority than uniforms, where charitable language wrapped around acts that never reached courtrooms. She had learned how often words like protection and philanthropy preceded silence. 10 years earlier, a fire had erased an industrial facility in New Jersey. The official cause had been an electrical failure, exacerbated by poor maintenance and outdated safety protocols. Insurance claims had been paid. Reports had been filed. The case had been closed. Erin had been a junior analyst then, still learning where the gaps lived. She had read the report because something about it felt too smooth, too complete. Fires were chaotic. This one had been tidy. She requested the file again now, knowing exactly where to look. The archive terminal hummed softly as she logged in. Her fingers moved with practiced certainty, filtering by year, location, incident type. The system returned the familiar file number. She opened it and let the first page load slowly, allowing herself to absorb the details she already knew. Industrial fire, night shift, casualties listed as undocumented workers, temporary hires, seasonal labor, names misspelled, ages approximated, nationalities generalized, a human blur reduced to columns. Erin scrolled. She stopped at the survivor list. There were 9 names, then a gap, then an addendum noting that one minor had been unaccounted for during initial processing and later presumed deceased due to lack of records. No body recovered. No follow-up. Erin leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes narrowing. Presumed deceased was a phrase she hated. It was an administrative convenience, a way of closing a door without checking what stood behind it. She pulled ancillary documents, emergency response logs, private security rosters, contractor agreements. She cross-referenced the facility's security provider with current registries. The company no longer existed under that name. It had merged, dissolved, reformed. Its executives had scattered into consulting roles, advisory boards, philanthropic trusts. One name caught her attention. Not from the fire, but from the fundraiser. Celeste Marrow's foundation had received a substantial donation from a trust established 8 years ago. The trust's original assets traced back to a shell company that had once held partial liability for the New Jersey facility. Erin felt the familiar tightening behind her eyes, the sensation that accompanied pattern recognition, not certainty, direction. She pulled the archived CCTV logs from the facility. Most of the footage had been destroyed in the fire, but metadata remained. Camera positions, maintenance records, a note indicating that one internal camera had been offline for 43 seconds during the critical window. 43 seconds. Erin closed her eyes briefly. At the fundraiser, a camera had gone dark for 40 seconds. Coincidences were inefficient. She exported the data and flagged it for deeper analysis. Then she searched for the missing minor again, this time without trusting the spelling. She removed vowels. She tried phonetic variants. She searched by age range, by approximate height, by partial identifiers. The system hesitated, then returned a result. Not a death record. A sealed adoption case. Erin's jaw tightened. The adoption had been processed out of state, expedited under emergency provisions. The child's name had been changed. The original records had been sealed due to safety concerns. The adoptive guardian's name had been redacted. This was not how legitimate adoptions worked. Not without court oversight. Not without a paper trail that could be audited. Erin requested access. The system denied her. She smiled thinly. Denials meant doors Doors meant leverage. While Aaron worked through bureaucracy, Jacob King sat in a private office that overlooked the river, watching the city pretend nothing was wrong. His jacket hung on the back of a chair. The bandage at his side pulled slightly when he moved, a dull reminder of how close the blade had come to changing everything. He welcomed the discomfort. Pain grounded him. It kept him from drifting into nostalgia. On the table in front of him lay several tablets, each displaying a different feed. Security footage, financial flows, personnel records. His people moved quietly around the edges of the room, speaking only when necessary. Jacob listened. The attempt on his life had been sloppy by design. The attacker had not been expected to succeed. He had been expected to be seen. That distinction mattered. Jacob traced the decision tree backward. Who benefited from panic? Who benefited from public violence? Who benefited from reminding everyone that old arrangements could still draw blood? The answer was not someone new. It never was. Jacob's mind returned, unbidden, to the night in New Jersey 10 years earlier, to the smell of smoke that did not behave like an accident, to the way private guards had formed lines before firefighters arrived, to the child he had seen near the perimeter, soot-streaked and silent, watching adults lie about what they were doing. He had not intervened then. Not because he did not care, but because he had understood, even at that age, that stepping forward would mean stepping alone. He had made a different choice. He had accepted a wound that could be explained publicly, a weakness that would keep him alive. His limp had become a story, a reminder, a warning. It had also become armor. Now, the past was knocking again. Jacob's people reported on Malin Ross's condition. The toxin in her blood was confirmed. The scar on her arm had been analyzed. It matched a medical implant removal, not cosmetic surgery. A controlled procedure performed in facilities that did not report to hospitals. She had been altered deliberately. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, replaying the image of her in the fundraiser hall. The stillness, the way her gaze had moved, the lack of panic. She was not reacting to danger. She was measuring it. That kind of composure did not come from nowhere. He adjusted his cane and stood, shifting his weight with practiced care. To anyone watching, the movement would look cautious. To those who knew him well, it would look restrained. In the days following the fundraiser, he allowed the narrative to stabilize. He did not issue statements. He did not demand arrests. He let speculation breathe. That was when people made mistakes. Meanwhile, Erin Doyle made progress. She did not force access to the sealed adoption record. Instead, she requested maintenance logs for the courthouse that had processed it. She found the clerk who had authorized the expedited seal. The clerk had retired 2 years later, moving to Florida with a generous pension that did not match her salary history. Erin pulled her bank records through a financial oversight channel. There it was. A consulting fee paid by a trust linked to the same shell network as the old security contractor. Erin exhaled slowly. The missing child had not been lost. She had been taken. Erin cross-referenced the adoption timeline with training facilities known to operate under private contracts. One stood out, a defunct medical research center that had briefly reopened under a different name, then closed again. Its location placed it within driving distance of the New Jersey site. She checked employment records. A young woman had been listed as a lab assistant there for 3 months. The photograph attached to the ID badge was grainy, outdated, and cropped poorly. Erin enlarged it. The face was older now, sharper, but the structure was unmistakable. Malin Ross. Erin sat back, letting the pieces settle. The child from the fire had survived. She had been removed from the record, trained, conditioned, and placed back into circulation years later under a fabricated identity. She had been kept on a chemical leash, her obedience ensured through biology rather than loyalty. And now, she had been brought into a room full of powerful people and used as bait. Aaron understood the implication immediately. This was not about killing Jacob King. It was about forcing history to surface. Jacob, for his part, began to see the shape of the trap. The attack had drawn attention to Malin. Her detention had drawn scrutiny. The toxin in her blood pointed to an organization that thrived in shadows. Someone wanted him to connect the dots, or they wanted him to hesitate. He reviewed footage of his own movement from the fundraiser again, the way he had pivoted, the way he had used the cane. He had not pretended then. He had acted. That mattered. Malin, still held in the basement room, noticed the change in her treatment. The questions stopped entirely. The men who entered no longer sought information. They observed, they measured. Food arrived regularly, water, no sedatives, no stimulants. The toxin did its work quietly. She felt the hours pass without markers. No windows, no clocks, only the steady hum of ventilation and the soft click of the camera lens adjusting focus. She used the time to watch herself. She tracked symptoms carefully, noting what intensified and what receded. She adjusted her posture to conserve energy. She let her thoughts move in controlled loops. She thought of fire. Not the flames themselves, but the moment after, when the air burned the lungs and the world looked like an unfinished photograph. She remembered running without knowing where. She remembered hands pulling her back from a perimeter. She remembered being told to stay quiet. Silence had kept her alive. It had also erased her. Now, silence had brought her here. In a different building, Aaron and Jacob's investigations began to approach the same conclusion from opposite sides. Neither contacted the other yet. They did not need to. The archive had spoken. The ash had settled into patterns. And both understood that the past had not been buried properly. It had only been filed. And filed things could always be reopened. By morning, the city had already chosen its version of the night. Headlines formed before facts. An anonymous source leaked the phrase attempted terrorist act, and the word spread faster than any correction ever could. The fundraiser became a target. The blade became ideology. Fear simplified everything it touched. Television panels debated security failures while carefully avoiding names that paid for advertising. Commentators spoke about threats, about vigilance, about the necessity of decisive action. No one spoke about private rooms beneath warehouses. Police were given a suspect before they asked for one. A man with a blurred past, a record thin enough to tear, an arrest that looked efficient on paper. His image circulated briefly, then disappeared beneath louder stories. The system absorbed him as it was designed to do. The case acquired a number, a jurisdiction, a set of procedures. Order restored itself with professional speed. Malin Ross was next in line to be processed. Officially, she was to be transferred into state custody for questioning related to the incident. Transparency was the word chosen. Cooperation, due process. The language soothed donors and reassured the public that institutions still functioned. In practice, the transfer was designed as a corridor without an exit. The route from the Brooklyn facility to the designated holding site passed through areas where oversight thinned, where jurisdiction blurred, where vehicles could be redirected without triggering alarms. Accidents happened there. Vehicles stalled. Escorts miscommunicated. People arrived late or not at all. The men who managed such things understood that violence was inefficient. Broken bodies created records. Dead bodies created questions. The most reliable disappearances occurred when someone was released into a process that hollowed them out slowly, stripping credibility, agency, and memory until they ceased to matter. That was the plan for Malin. Inside the holding room, she felt the shift before it manifested. Her meals changed, not in quantity, but in composition. The lighting adjusted, becoming harsher at irregular intervals, disrupting her sense of time. The hum of the ventilation altered its rhythm, occasionally dropping into silence long enough to make her breathing sound too loud. No one touched her. No one needed to. She recognized the technique. It was designed to erode certainty, to make her doubt her own internal clock, her own physical responses. The toxin in her blood amplified the effect, tightening her nerves, clouding her concentration just enough to make resistance costly. She stayed still. She conserved. Above her, decisions were being made. Jacob King chose his moment carefully. He did not rush to microphones. He did not issue dramatic statements. He waited until the narrative had settled into something stable, something he could fracture cleanly. When he spoke, he did so through channels that carried weight without spectacle. A brief appearance, controlled language, a measured tone. He framed the incident as personal rather than political. A provocation rooted in private grievance, not organized extremism. He dismissed any suggestion of foreign involvement with deliberate calm. He expressed regret for the disruption. He emphasized cooperation with authorities. To observers, it looked like retreat. To those who understood the calculus of power, it was an intrusion. By rejecting the more dangerous narrative, Jacob stripped certain players of the justification they needed. The word terrorist had been useful. It had allowed extraordinary measures. Its removal narrowed options. Criticism followed immediately. Opinion pieces questioned his judgment. Anonymous sources suggested he was protecting someone. Whispers circulated about liability, about conflicts of interest. His reputation, carefully maintained over years of calculated restraint, took a controlled hit. Jacob accepted it without visible reaction. He had learned long ago that reputation was a resource meant to be spent. Inside the family structure that bore his name, the response was colder. Jacob's intervention disrupted arrangements that had already been set in motion. People who had expected the transfer to proceed quietly found themselves blocked by procedural delays. The planned erasure stalled. That kind of obstruction did not go unanswered. If Malin could not be removed officially, she would be neutralized informally. The environment around her grew more precise. Her routines were altered without explanation. Her access to water was delayed, then restored. Her sleep was interrupted by sudden light, then prolonged by unnatural darkness. The goal was not pain. Pain produced defiance. The goal was erosion. She was watched closely for signs of collapse. None came. Her silence remained intact, not stubborn, not dramatic, simply present. That unsettled them. A person who broke could be managed. A person who adapted became unpredictable. Jacob received reports describing her condition in neutral terms. Stable, non-compliant, resistant to psychological pressure. The kind of phrasing used when something did not behave as expected. He requested access. Not to her directly, to the process. His people examined the logs, the lighting adjustments, the nutrition changes, the environmental manipulations. Each modification was subtle, defensible individually. Together, they formed a pattern. Jacob recognized the tactic. It was not punishment. It was preparation. They were trying to empty her out before handing her over, ensuring that by the time she reached official custody, she would be incoherent, unreliable, easy to discredit. A witness rendered useless by exhaustion. Jacob adjusted his strategy. He did not block the transfer outright. That would have escalated conflict. Instead, he complicated it. He introduced additional oversight under the guise of compliance. Medical evaluations, Independent observers, paperwork that required signatures from multiple offices. Each layer slowed the process and increased visibility. At the same time, he quietly shifted personnel. Guards reassigned, drivers replaced, routes reconsidered. Not enough to stop the plan. Enough to force improvisation. Inside the family, frustration sharpened into resentment. Jacob's willingness to absorb criticism threatened others who preferred efficiency to exposure. They began working around him, not against him directly. The pressure on Malin intensified in response. Her meals arrived colder. Her room grew quieter. The hum of ventilation flattened into an oppressive monotone. Human presence receded. Isolation became the primary instrument. She felt it working at the edges of her concentration, dulling sensation, stretching minutes into hours. The toxin amplified the effect, turning small discomforts into distractions that demanded energy. She rationed her attention. She focused on physical anchors, the pressure of the floor beneath her feet, the weight of her body against the chair, the steady rise and fall of her chest. She refused to disappear. That refusal, quiet and internal, made her dangerous. Jacob understood this instinctively. He had survived by cultivating a similar discipline, by learning when to yield publicly and when to remain rigid internally. Watching the reports, he recognized the shape of someone who had been taught to endure without signaling distress. Such people were not assets, they were variables. The city continued to demand resolution. The media cycle moved on to other threats, but the case remained a reference point. Politicians spoke about security reform. Donors issued statements. The fundraiser's foundation announced additional contributions to public safety initiatives. Everything appeared to stabilize. Beneath that surface, tension coiled tighter. The order to proceed with the transfer was reissued, this time with modifications. Increased security, adjusted timing, a narrower window for interference. Jacob allowed it to stand. From the outside, it looked like acquiescence. Inside the Brooklyn facility, Malin was informed of the transfer through action rather than words. Her clothing was changed again. Her hands were checked, then left unrestrained. A calculated decision meant to signal normalcy. The cameras adjusted to new angles. The door opened and remained open longer than usual. Movement returned to the space. She registered it all with detached clarity. The moment of transit was approaching. She did not know whether she would survive it. She did not know whether Jacob's intervention had altered the outcome or merely delayed it. She only knew that whatever came next would define whether she remained an object or became something else. Above ground, Jacob prepared to accept the consequences of his choice. By reframing the narrative, he had drawn attention to himself. By slowing the process, he had irritated people who preferred clean endings. By allowing the transfer to proceed, he acknowledged that mercy, offered publicly, could function as a trap. That was its purpose. If they attempted to erase her during transport, the visibility he had created would turn an inconvenience into a scandal. If they refrained, she would enter state custody intact enough to speak. Either outcome destabilized the arrangement. The only unacceptable result would be her disappearance without trace. He had made that impossible without appearing to try. As the preparations continued, Jacob reflected on the cost of the move. His position within the family would weaken. Allies would reconsider their loyalties. Some doors would close. He accepted this as necessary attrition. Malin, in her quiet room, sensed the shift as a change in pressure rather than information. The environment no longer felt designed solely to wear her down. It felt provisional, as if someone, somewhere, had complicated the math. She did not allow herself hope. Hope created vulnerability. Instead, she prepared for a moment that might never come. The smallest opportunity, the slightest misalignment. She remained still. In the city above, traffic flowed. Offices opened. Coffee was poured. The night's violence receded into memory for most people. But for those involved, the illusion of resolution was only that. Mercy had been offered publicly. Privately, it tightened like a snare. And everyone who mattered understood that once set, it would either catch something alive or tear itself apart trying. The solution did not come from instinct or desperation. It came from paperwork. Aaron Doyle found it buried inside a protocol appendix that had never been meant for field use. A narrow document, circulated once and then archived, written in language so dry it discouraged curiosity. It outlined emergency countermeasures for rare biochemical exposures, the kind encountered by contractors operating outside conventional oversight. Most of it concerned containment and liability. One subsection, flagged but unexplored, described a compound designed to suppress vital signs temporarily without inducing cellular death. It was not folklore. It was not a street trick. It was chemistry calibrated for deniability. The compound had been developed as a contingency, a way to remove compromised assets from circulation without creating a corpse that demanded investigation. It slowed respiration to the edge of absence, dropped heart activity below standard detection thresholds, and flattened neural responses enough to deceive cursory examinations. It did not last indefinitely. The margin between survival and damage was narrow. Timing mattered. Aaron understood immediately why it had been shelved. Used incorrectly, it would kill. Used correctly, it would erase someone from active reality for a precise window. 3 days. That was the upper limit. Beyond that, recovery degraded sharply. Below it, the subject could return with minimal long-term impairment. Aaron traced the compound's custody chain. Predictably, access was restricted to the same network that controlled the toxin in Malin Ross's bloodstream. The leash and the key were held by the same hands. There would be no legitimate request, no formal requisition that did not alert the wrong people. She closed the file and sat still, considering the angles. Legal options did not exist. Medical ethics ended where private contracts began. If Malin was to be removed from the corridor closing around her, it would require an act that fell between categories. Not authorized, not entirely forbidden, simply unaccounted for. Jacob King did not hesitate when Aaron presented the outline. He listened, absorbing the details without interruption. The risks, the margins, the necessity of precision, the certainty that once initiated, the maneuver could not be undone publicly. If it failed, Malin would die quietly, and the city would accept it as administrative fallout. If it succeeded, she would vanish. Jacob weighed this without visible reaction. The alternative was worse. Transfer into state custody would expose her to procedural decay, a slow grinding that ended in silence without spectacle. She would be discredited, scattered across reports, reduced to a footnote. The staged death offered a single advantage. It ended the public story. Once declared dead, Malin would no longer be an object of jurisdiction. No agency pursued the testimony of a body. No committee subpoenaed the dead. Attention moved on. But disappearance created a vacuum. Vacuum attracted cleaners. Jacob understood the cost. He approved the plan with the kind of decisiveness that came from having already accepted loss. His instructions were concise. No unnecessary witnesses, no improvisation, absolute timing. The night chosen for the procedure carried no significance. That was deliberate. Significance invited memory. The room used was not the Brooklyn basement. That location had too many eyes, too much institutional weight. Instead, A smaller medical space was prepared in a building scheduled for renovation. The kind of place where records were incomplete and staff turnover frequent. It smelled of antiseptic layered over something older, metallic, and faintly sweet. Malin was brought there under the pretense of evaluation. Her body had already begun to feel different. The toxin that had regulated her compliance had been altered subtly over the previous hours, adjusted to reduce its grip without triggering alarms. She registered the change as a slight easing behind her eyes, a lessening of internal pressure. It was not relief, it was potential. She was placed on a narrow table. Her restraints were minimal. The environment was controlled, quiet, efficient. She did not ask questions. Questions created obligations. She observed instead. The compound entered her bloodstream cleanly. The first sensation was cold, spreading outward from the injection site. Not pain, absence. Her breathing slowed without resistance. Her heart rate dropped in deliberate increments. Consciousness receded not as darkness but as distance. The room pulled away from her, sounds flattening, light narrowing. She did not panic. She let go. Monitoring equipment tracked the descent. Readings dipped below thresholds calibrated to trigger concern in standard examinations. To anyone performing a rapid assessment, she would appear clinically dead. No detectable pulse, no responsive reflexes, no spontaneous respiration. Time mattered now. When the readings stabilized at the lower bound, the equipment was disconnected. Her body was wrapped in neutral fabric, not ceremonial, not intimate. She was moved efficiently, without reverence. She became cargo. Her exit from the building was logged as routine. A body removal, a necessary administrative step. No sirens, no escort. The vehicle carrying her merged into traffic and vanished into the grid. The declaration followed hours later. Malin Ross was recorded as deceased while in custody, cause pending further review. A statement was prepared, regret expressed, responsibility diffused across procedural language. The city accepted it with practiced indifference. News cycles acknowledged the update briefly, then pivoted. Another unfortunate casualty. Another case closed without ceremony. Jacob King read the report in a quiet office and felt nothing resembling victory. He knew what came next. The moment Malin was declared dead, she ceased to exist as a liability and became a loose end. Loose ends were hunted. The group responsible for the New Jersey fire had survived by mastering erasure. They did not believe in coincidences. A sudden death inside custody, following high-profile interference, triggered review. Not public, internal. They dispatched people who did not look like killers, because killers drew attention. These operatives arrived as contractors, as technicians, as logistics specialists assigned to review records, to ensure compliance, to clean up procedural irregularities. They moved through the city with the confidence of people accustomed to access. They did not seek Malin directly. They sought confirmation. They checked transport logs, medical records, storage facilities. They spoke to coroners, to clerks, to drivers who had not realized they were being interviewed. They looked for inconsistencies. Jacob's control of the city tightened. He stopped pretending to be peripheral. His limp remained, but it no longer defined him. He moved decisively, rerouting information flows, sealing access points, redirecting attention. His presence became overt, not as threat, but as authority. Those accustomed to operating around him adjusted, uncertain whether his shift signaled desperation or resolve. It signaled neither. It signaled timing. Malin regained consciousness in stages. First sensation returned as pressure in her chest, then breath, sharp and involuntary. Her lungs burned briefly as they remembered function. Sound followed, distant at first, then nearer. the low hum of traffic, the whisper of wind against glass. Light came last. She opened her eyes to a ceiling unfamiliar in its plainness. White paint. A hairline crack near one corner. The room smelled faintly of detergent and rain. She lay still, allowing her body to recalibrate. Her limbs felt heavy but responsive. The toxin leash was gone. In its place lingered exhaustion and a hollow ache that ran deep but clean. She was alive. That realization carried no relief. She turned her head slowly and took in the space. A modest apartment, neutral furniture, windows overlooking a cityscape washed gray by early morning, the kind of place chosen for its forgettability. She understood the implications immediately. She was dead to the world. Dead meant freedom from jurisdiction. It also meant vulnerability without protection. Her survival now depended entirely on movement. Jacob did not visit her, not immediately. That was intentional. Contact created patterns. Patterns were traced. Instead, he monitored the city's response. He watched which records were accessed, which requests were filed, which people asked questions they should not have known to ask. The cleaners moved carefully, but they moved. Jacob countered with equal precision. He fed them plausible confirmations, partial truths, enough to satisfy surface scrutiny without revealing the core deception. He let them believe they were close, then redirected them toward dead ends. The city became a maze of mirrored corridors. Malin used the time to recover. She tested her body slowly, noting residual weakness but no permanent damage. The compound had done its work. She ate. She slept. She watched the street below, memorizing rhythms. She thought about names. Not out of sentiment, out of necessity. She had been given a chance, not an escape. Her life remained provisional, contingent on what she could deliver in return. She understood that without bitterness. Debt was a language she spoke fluently. When Jacob finally observed her directly, it was from a distance. Security feeds, surveillance loops, the way she moved through the apartment, cautious but purposeful, the way she positioned herself near exits, the way she watched reflections. She was not broken. She was sharpened. The alliance that formed between them was never spoken aloud. It did not need to be. It existed in alignment rather than agreement. They shared an objective, to survive long enough to force the truth into light. Not as confession, as structure. Names would be named, connections traced, the architecture of the past exposed. That required patience. For 3 days, Malin remained dead. The city adjusted around her absence. Files were closed, interests recalculated, the illusion of resolution settled. On the 4th morning, she stepped into a different phase of existence. Alive but unrecognized. Free but hunted. And ready to move forward, not for redemption but for completion. The light inside the records facility was too bright for comfort. It flattened everything it touched, stripping shadows from corners that preferred to keep them. Erin Doyle felt it immediately when she passed through the security gate and entered the central archive floor. Rows of shelves stretched into the distance, each packed with boxes labeled in neutral fonts, each holding fragments of decisions that had once ruined lives quietly. The air was dry, filtered, preserved. It smelled of paper, dust, and the faint chemical note of aging ink. This was where the state stored its memory, not as truth, but as inventory. Erin moved with purpose. Her access credentials had not been revoked yet. That window would close soon. She worked methodically, pulling files that had not been requested in years, cross-referencing them with digital records stored on servers humming behind locked doors. Contracts surfaced first. Private security agreements written in vague language, heavy on indemnity clauses and light on accountability. Addendums followed, stapled to original documents years later, altering jurisdiction and oversight with a few lines of text. She traced payment schedules next. Insurance settlements paid out rapidly after the New Jersey fire, faster than standard investigations allowed. The recipients were shell companies with lifespans measured in months. Each dissolved cleanly after funds moved on. Aaron followed those trails into trusts and holding groups that now sponsored cultural institutions, hospitals, and academic programs. The same names appeared repeatedly. People who sat on boards, people who spoke publicly about ethics and reform, people whose signatures had authorized security deployments at the industrial site a decade earlier, and whose influence now reached into legislative committees. The pattern was no longer subtle. Aaron compiled the data into a single chain, linking events across time through money, contracts, and administrative decisions. She did not editorialize. She let the documents speak in their own cold language. The story they told was structural, not emotional. It described a system that protected itself by distributing guilt so thinly it became invisible. She saved the files in multiple locations. Redundancy was survival. Across the city, Jacob King prepared his final move. The meeting was arranged in a private dining room overlooking the river, chosen not for luxury but for discretion. The table was long and polished, its surface empty of plates. No waitstaff hovered nearby. No music softened the air. Only folders, encrypted drives, and tablets lay arranged with deliberate symmetry. The attendees arrived individually, drawn by different incentives. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of obligation. A few came because refusing would have raised questions they could not afford. Jacob greeted them with controlled neutrality. He did not posture. He did not threaten. His presence alone altered the room's balance. His limp remained, but it no longer suggested weakness. It had become irrelevant. The exchange began without ceremony. Files moved across the table. Not accusations, but evidence. Contract copies, audit trails, internal memos flagged but never addressed. Each attendee recognized something meant for their eyes only. The realization spread quietly. This was not an attack from outside. It was exposure from within. Jacob did not attempt to dismantle the structure in one stroke. He understood its resilience too well. Instead, he introduced pressure points. Conflicts of interest surfaced. Overlapping directorships became visible. Regulatory violations, previously dismissed as minor, acquired context. Information leaked selectively, not to the public at first, but to oversight bodies that could not ignore it once documented. The system reacted, as systems always did. Investigations were announced. Committees convened. Reviews initiated. Each move triggered countermoves. Allies turned cautious. Partnerships frayed. People began protecting themselves, shifting blame sideways. The structure began to consume its own. Jacob watched this unfold with detached attention. He had no illusion of justice. This was not about morality. It was about momentum. Once set in motion, the chain could not be fully controlled by any single hand. Meanwhile, Malin moved through the city without a name. She avoided places that remembered her. She chose routes based on reflection and flow, navigating crowds with the ease of someone accustomed to invisibility. Her existence remained unofficial. She had no documents tying her to the present moment. That absence was both shield and vulnerability. When she met Aaron, it was in a municipal storage annex near a courthouse scheduled for renovation. The building smelled of dust and old varnish. Light filtered through high windows, harsh and unkind. Malin carried with her a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a token, once shown to her as proof of guilt. A marker used to justify the fire, the deaths, the erasure. She had kept it hidden through years of displacement, not out of sentiment, but because she had sensed its weight even when she did not understand it fully. Under Aaron's examination, the token revealed itself as a fabrication. Its materials did not match the era it claimed. Its markings aligned with a private security unit's internal coding, not any legitimate authority. It was a false artifact planted to redirect blame. That token bridged the past and the present. It tied the New Jersey fire to the attempted attack on Jacob, not through motive, but through method. The same people who had engineered plausible deniability then were attempting to close the loop now. Malin handed the token over without ceremony. In doing so, she relinquished the last physical tie to the identity that had been imposed on her. She did not reclaim her name publicly. That would come later or not at all. What mattered was internal alignment. She no longer moved as an instrument reacting to pressure. She moved with intent. The investigations accelerated. Courtrooms filled with the dry sound of paper being shuffled. Depositions were scheduled. Subpoenas issued. Executives testified with rehearsed composure that faltered under cross-reference. Documents contradicted statements. Timelines fractured. The light inside these spaces was unforgiving. It exposed inconsistencies. It bleached excuses. Jacob's role remained officially peripheral. He cooperated when asked. He provided documentation without commentary. His name appeared in filings but not as a central figure. That was intentional. Visibility was a resource he rationed carefully. Malin stayed out of sight entirely. Her safety depended on momentum. As long as the system focused inward, consuming its own contradictions, there was less attention to spare for a ghost. The group that had once specialized in erasure struggled to adapt. Their methods relied on silence and isolation. Under scrutiny, those tools lost effectiveness. Attempts to intervene risked exposure. Patience, once their strength, became liability. They did not disappear. They retreated. The city adjusted to the slow burn of consequence. It did not become safer. It became louder, more careful. People watched what they signed. Cameras were checked twice. Procedures tightened not out of ethics but fear. Jacob stood on a balcony overlooking the river one night, the city's lights reflecting in broken lines across the water. He shifted his weight without thinking, distributing it evenly. The limp no longer dictated his movement. He noticed this only afterward, with mild surprise. Malin stood elsewhere, on a rooftop above a street that never fully slept. She watched traffic flow, memorizing patterns out of habit. The night air was sharp, clean after rain. She felt present in her body in a way she had not in years. They did not meet. They did not need to. Their paths had aligned long enough to change the board. The game was not over. It never would be, but its geometry had shifted. Pieces that were meant to remain buried had resurfaced. Pieces that were supposed to be dead had moved again. Jacob understood that he could no longer hide behind the narrative of injury. His continued survival required direct engagement. The cost would be ongoing. He accepted it without regret. Malin understood that emptiness was no longer an option. She carried too much knowledge to disappear completely. Her future would require precision, discretion, and the willingness to act when silence ceased to be sufficient. Neither of them believed in absolution. What they believed in was continuation. The light that cut through the archives and courtrooms was not merciful. It did not heal. It revealed. And in that exposure, both understood that legends and clemency had reached their limit. What remained was the cold, deliberate will to keep moving forward, even when forward looked like another night in a city that excelled at pretending nothing had happened. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.